It is a hot afternoon in summer. You are 8 years old. You have been outside for hours. The kitchen feels very far away, and you are thirsty. So you do what almost every kid did. You pick up the green garden hose lying in the grass. You twist the nozzle. You let the warm water run until it turns cool, and you drink. The water tastes faintly of plastic. You never thought about that taste again. In 2016, a lab in Ann Arbor, Michigan did. Researchers at the Ecology Center bought 32 ordinary garden hoses from 6 of the largest retailers in America, including Home Depot, Lowe's, Walmart, and Amazon. They cut the hoses apart and ran the pieces through an X-ray analyzer. Inside a large share of them, they found something that should never be in a product that carries water: ground up electronic waste. That faint plastic taste had a source. This was not a fringe outfit looking for a headline. Since 2007, the same lab has tested more than 15,000 consumer products, from children's car seats to handbags to food cans. The garden hose study screened for lead, cadmium, phthalates, bromine, antimony, and tin. Those last few are the reason this story exists, because of where they come from. The report did not soften its conclusion. It called on the national retailers and the manufacturers to phase the lead, the phthalates and the contaminated scrap out of garden hoses entirely. To understand what the lab found, you have to understand what most cheap garden hoses are made of. The flexible green tubing coiled on the shelf at the hardware store is usually PVC, the same vinyl plastic used in pipes and flooring. On its own, PVC is rigid. To make it soft enough to bend, manufacturers add other chemicals. To make it cheap, some of them add recycled plastic scrap. The cheapest scrap on the market comes from old wire, cable, and circuit boards, ground into pellets and melted back down. Electronic waste. The filler saves a manufacturer a few cents per hose. A new batch of clean vinyl costs money. Ground-up cable insulation is nearly free, because someone is paying to get rid of it. The Ecology Center did not just suspect this was happening. They measured it. When recycled e-waste vinyl is used as filler, it leaves a chemical fingerprint, a specific combination of bromine, antimony, tin, and lead that tracks together across samples. The researchers ran the correlations. Bromine in the hoses moved almost in lockstep with antimony and with lead, and also with copper, tin, and gold, the metals you find in discarded electronics. The bromine points to brominated flame retardants, the kind used to keep cables from catching fire. The antimony is a flame retardant booster. The tin points to organotin stabilizers, common in wire insulation. 3 hoses carried tin at 3,000 to 4,000 parts per million, and those same 3 hoses had the highest lead, bromine, and antimony of the entire group, along with elevated gold and copper. That is not a coincidence. That is a circuit board in a hose. The researchers had seen this exact signature before. Earlier that same year, the lab had traced recycled PVC from electronic waste into vinyl floor tiles, and the chemical pattern in these hoses matched the tiles almost exactly. Over a third of all the hoses carried that fingerprint. Among the PVC hoses specifically, half of them contained e-waste vinyl contaminated with toxic chemicals. The research director put it plainly. Garden hoses, he said, had become a dumping ground for highly contaminated electronic waste. So what was actually in the plastic? Start with lead, which is in e-waste vinyl, because lead is added to cable and wire insulation as a stabilizer. 1/3 of all the hoses tested contained lead above 100 parts per million, the legal limit for lead in children's products. Among the PVC hoses, 29% crossed that line. And the worst was not close. A 15-foot utility hose sold at Home Depot measured 6.8% lead by weight. That is 68,000 parts per million. It is more than 600 times the limit set for products a child might handle. A hose reel leader sold at Walmart measured 5,200 parts per million. Then there were the phthalates, a family of plasticizers used to soften vinyl, several of which are banned in children's products. The lab found phthalates in 75% of the PVC hoses. And the e-waste markers, bromine and antimony, showed up together in half of them. One hose sold at Lowe's, the Apex Never Kink, carried the full set. Phthalate plasticizers, 366 parts per million lead, 1,779 parts per million antimony, and 1,592 parts per million bromine. The complete chemical signature of recycled electronics, sitting in a coil on a store shelf, sold to water a garden. A list of chemicals in plastic is one thing. The question that matters is whether any of it gets into the water. So the lab tested that directly. They filled 6 hoses with ordinary tap water, capped them, and let the water sit inside for 48 hours. Then, they tested the water that came out. In 3 of the 6 samples, lead had leached into the water at 13, 19, and 20 parts per billion. The federal action level for lead in drinking water is 15 parts per billion. 2 of those 3 samples were over the line. One sample contained BPA, a hormone-disrupting chemical, at 87 parts per billion. The pattern was exactly what you would expect. The hoses with the most lead in the plastic were the ones that leached lead into the water. The drinking water safe hose they tested leached none at all. The researchers were careful about what they could and could not explain. The 2016 water actually came out cleaner than in earlier years, and 2 hoses that clearly contained phthalates did not leach a measurable amount into the water. They reported that openly and said they did not know why. That is what a study looks like when it is not trying to sell you a hose, and 48 hours in the shade is the gentle version of this test. In an earlier round of the same research, one water sample contained the phthalate DEHP at 25 parts per billion. The federal limit for DEHP in drinking water is 6. That single sample was more than 4 times the legal limit. The Ecology Center also notes that heat speeds the process up. A hose left coiled in direct sun all afternoon, the way most hoses are stored, leaches more than a hose kept in the shade. The first water out of a hot hose is the most concentrated because it has been sitting against the plastic the longest. Now the part the numbers are pointing at. Why any of this matters for a human being. The chemicals the lab measured are not obscure. Lead is a developmental neurotoxin, and according to the Centers for Disease Control, there is no level of lead exposure considered safe for a child. In children, lead is tied to lower IQ and lasting learning problems, and the effect does not require a dramatic dose. The damage from lead is cumulative, built from small repeated doses over time, which is exactly how a garden hose delivers it. Phthalates and BPA are endocrine disruptors, meaning they interfere with the body's hormone system. The Ecology Center listed what these chemicals have been linked to in laboratory studies: birth defects, impaired learning, liver toxicity, premature birth, early puberty, and hormone disruption. Now, picture the ordinary uses of a garden hose: filling a child's wading pool, running a sprinkler that kids run through all afternoon, filling a dog's water bowl, and the warm first drink on a hot day, straight from the nozzle. The one almost everyone watching this has taken at least once. There is one more use that turns this from a personal problem into a slower one. Watering a vegetable garden. A staff scientist on the study made the point directly. Even if you carefully avoid pesticides and grow everything organically, she said, you could still be adding hazardous chemicals to your soil by watering with one of these hoses. The water carries lead and phthalates onto the soil and onto the produce. The lead does not break down. It accumulates in the ground season after season, and some of it can be taken up through the roots into the food you grew specifically to be healthier. And soil does not stay in the garden. It ends up on hands, on knees, and on the surface of the vegetables, which is how lead in dirt becomes lead in a child. The hose quietly works against the entire reason you planted the garden. The staff scientist also noted the obvious. None of these chemicals are necessary in a garden hose, and safe hoses already exist on the same shelves. The fix is cheap and specific, and before you buy it comes down to two things you can check on the label. First, the materials. The worst hoses were PVC. Every single one of the best-rated hoses in the study was polyurethane, and the two polyurethane hoses labeled safe for drinking contain no chemicals of concern at all. So the simplest rule is to buy a hose that is not PVC, and polyurethane is the proven safe choice. If the label does not say what the hose is made of, assume it is PVC. Second, the labels. Look for the words drinking water safe. The 10 hoses with that label were free of significant lead, bromine, antimony, and tin, though 3 of them still carried phthalates, so it is a strong signal and not a perfect guarantee. Watch one specific trick. A label that says lead-free couplings is only talking about the metal fittings on the ends. It says nothing about the flexible hose itself, which can still be loaded with lead. Many hoses with lead-free couplings were among the contaminated ones. And avoid any hose that carries a California proposition. 65 warning. The small label that says the product contains chemicals known to cause cancer or birth defects. That label is telling you exactly what is inside. Even if you keep the hose you already own, 3 habits lower the risk. Store it in the shade, not coiled in the sun, because heat drives the chemicals into the water. Let it run for several seconds before you use it, long enough to clear the water that has been sitting and concentrating inside. And do not drink from it, and do not let your kids drink from it, unless you know for certain it is drinking water safe. It is worth sitting with how ordinary this is. Not a scandal hidden in a factory overseas. A product on a shelf at the biggest stores in the country, doing exactly what it was built to do, carrying water. There is a genuinely hopeful number in this story. The market is already moving. The share of hoses with high lead metal fittings dropped from 40% in 2011 to 15% a few years later. And a clean polyurethane hose now costs only a little more than the contaminated kind. The toxic hose is just the default option, sitting at eye level, costing $1 less, in a coil of green plastic that most people will never think twice about. The lab thought twice. Now you have too. If a video like this is worth your time, subscribe. It is the one signal that tells these stories to keep getting made. I will see you in the next one.